everyone. I'm Nikki Klegel with Fulfill Your Legacy.
I'm Tim Breen, pastor at First Reformed Church here in Northwest Iowa.
All
Orange
right.
City, yeah.
We are on lesson 13. We are still in a world in need of love. So go ahead and share with us about Jeremiah.
So last week we talked about Hosea, who was in that group of the minor prophets. We said that they were minor not because they were less important, but because their books were shorter. And just the way that the people who organized the sequence of the Old Testament structured things kind of longer to shorter. So Hosea was one of the minor prophets. Jeremiah is in the major prophets. He wrote two books, actually, the book of Jeremiah, which has his name, and the book of Lamentations, which goes into greater detail about life after your hometown is destroyed. It's a really, really gloomy book. It's called Lamentations, which means like weeping, lament, sadness. But he was a really important figure, called into ministry when he was probably just a kid. Didn't want to do it, didn't think it made sense, but he was obedient to God, and he had a very, very long and pretty difficult ministry of serving on God's behalf.
All right, so then tell us a little bit more about why God let this exile happen and what was the significance of all this?
Really, you don't have a full grasp on the story and the trajectory of the Old Testament until you talk about exile. And people talk about a couple different captivities in the Old Testament. One is the Egyptian captivity. We discussed that earlier when the people were slaves in Egypt. But the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian exile came quite a bit later. Just to set the stage historically a little bit, King David, we talked about earlier, and King Solomon, David's son, had big empires. They had, they controlled a lot of territory, had a good amount of wealth and political influence. That was pretty rare for God's people in Old Testament days. In most cases, they were kind of a smaller country surrounded by superpowers, the superpower of Egypt and the superpower that was to the east of them, Assyria, and then Babylonia after. Long story short, at two different occasions in the 8th century BC and then in the 6th century BC, armies from these big eastern superpowers came and destroyed the nations of Israel first, 722 BC, and then Judah, 586 BC. And during the first of these destructions, most of the people just got scattered all over the place, can never be heard from again. Something different happened in that second disaster when Jerusalem itself in Judah was destroyed. The Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, came in, knocked over a bunch of stuff, but then what they did is they took the youngest and brightest and best upcoming leaders from among the Jewish people, and they deported them over to Babylon to try to make them into Babylonians. And so a number of people were forced to live in a different country before being sent back about 50 years afterwards. Now, what caused this exile? Why did this happen? Well, as I mentioned, first and foremost, the people of God didn't have the size of army that these other nations had. They didn't have the resources, did not have the wealth, so they were smaller from the get-go. But the Bible shares this lesson with us that there are two causes for the exile, specifically the exile of Judah into Babylon, the one Jeremiah is referring to. The first is idolatry, and that is that the people worshipped the wrong gods. They were brought out of Egypt by the true God, Yahweh, and God asked them to have an exclusive relationship, but they decided to see other people, back in the terminology we talked about with Hosea. And so they worshiped the true God, but they had a few other gods that they worshiped as well. And in other words, their hearts were not fully devoted to God. So idolatry was problem number one. And then the second set of issues, which are really addressed in the book of Amos, which is in the Bible right by Hosea, is that there was serious social injustice happening in the land. The rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, people were not being taken care of, widows were being overlooked, people were being compared to and priced the same as a pair of shoes. Imagine that, if a person's life was worth as much as their Nikes or Reeboks. It's a really difficult time. And people like Amos said, yeah, we've got idolatry, and because you do not believe in the true God, you become godless. And as Jesus would say, because you don't love the Lord your God, you're not loving your neighbor as yourself. And so the people were carried off into exile and punished by God. And interestingly, they were punished by people who were probably even worse. The Babylonians and the Assyrians were not like the little, the choir boys or anything. They were even worse. They worshiped false gods. They didn't have great social justice either. But God used them and then the Persians after them as an instrument of correcting his people, correcting their mistakes. And Nikki, sometimes we go through pain in life, and sometimes there's sort of inexplicable suffering. We have to admit that. But sometimes we get what we deserve. And we, looking back, said, I made a bad decision. I did something I knew I shouldn't have done. I left something undone I was really feeling called to, and I dropped the ball, and I kind of am having to deal with the fallout. And that's the story of exile, where the people had to deal with the fallout from their own sin and idolatry. So what happens in that is that the people recognize that you put good in, you get good out. You put bad in, you get bad out. But this word from Jeremiah we read today, 30 and 31, actually presents things in a slightly different light, especially toward the end of chapter 31, where God talks about a new covenant. What he seems to be saying is that old way where it's kind of the karma system, you do the wrong things, you get punished, you do good things, and you get rewarded, is not always going to be the way it works. And in fact, God says, there will be times where people do the wrong thing, but I'm going to love them anyway. They are going to make mistakes, and they're even going to be deliberate in skipping out on the things I've called them to, but I'm not going to give up on them. And that's what we call grace. It's not deserved favor. It's not earned or merited blessing. We get it even though we don't deserve it. And this is a New Testament idea, but we start to see here in the New Covenant, Jeremiah chapter 31, it's beginning to break in among God's people already, where they don't get what they deserve, they get far better than they deserve.
Yeah, I can't help but, as I'm listening to you, feel so compelled to not use and abuse God. I mean, during this time, idolatry was the huge problem that they were battling against, and look at us today. I mean, there's so many things that we worship, and we don't, we always think it's worshiping another God, but we're forgetting that, alcohol is our God, or our work is our God, or whatever. And so we have this gift where he's going to love us anyway, and not wanting to take advantage of that.
Yeah, anytime we take something God has given to us as a tool and we make it our master, idolatry happens. And vice versa. Anytime you take what our master should be, our Lord, and we make him a tool, God is just like our accountant or our personal assistant. That's idolatry too. That just flips the whole system on its head.
Yeah, it's really good.
And so there are ways that we, even though we don't bow down to statues or maybe offer sacrifices to images of stone and wood, that we get the priorities out of order. And idolatry is a lot about priorities too, Nikki. Place the most important priorities at the top, that's God, and you should be okay. But once you invert that priority list, where you allow it to get rejiggered, where your career is number one, or your kids are number one, or getting that scholarship is number one, you are going to have problems.
Yeah. All right, well, we will leave you guys. We head into 14 next time. Thank you.